Welcome back, Lisa Ansell, to Rad Futures. I'm super excited to talk to you again. It's been a long time.
So
Um,
glad to be here.
so you're writing for various journals and papers. I saw you have an article in the LA Times. You have been writing for the Jewish Journal. And you've written some pieces lately that are relevant to the student loan debt kind of discussion in different ways.
Mhm.
And I just kind of wanted to catch up with you, find out, what else is going on in your world, especially regarding your work around student loan debt and the housing crisis in particular. Because I know that I read your LA Times letter to the editor from December
Mhm.
17th in 2024. And in
Right.
that letter, you mentioned the quote, deadly trifecta of unaffordable housing, predatory student loan debt, and real estate speculation. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that for the listeners and speak to why this trifecta, why this combination is deadly.
Yeah, of course, Jessica. And, thank you so much for, engaging in this topic as well. Student loan debt is really a national crisis that is eroding the lives and livelihoods of 45 million Americans across 4 generations. And so we're talking about from, college graduates to senior citizens who are or about to have their Social Security checks garnished come
Mm,
May 5th. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides that they want to be an activist, right? Activists are born out of trauma. And I would say this is very much the case in my own life. I, I am a student loan debt survivor. I was an indentured servant to the student loan debt scam for many years. I've been debt free for 4 years, but I don't attribute that to any merit on my part at all. I attribute that to the random and haphazard nature of student debt cancellation through the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. I was denied 8 times before I was finally granted my lawful cancellation.
wow.
So as an educator, I have become very interested and invested in the overlapping crises that are eroding the quality of life of public servants in America.
Mhm.
These are our community heroes, our teachers, our police officers, our firefighters, our healthcare workers.
Yeah.
So, um, oftentimes, public servants are caught at the epicenter of the crises of unaffordable housing, student loan debt, and low wages. Public servants earn too much to qualify for government assistance, but too little to actually break out of the cycle of rentership and into
Right.
home ownership.
Right.
And that is exactly what happened to me. And I place so much of the blame on the years of student loan debt that I was forced into paying after having reached the 10-year requirement of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program to have the remainder of my student loans canceled.
Yeah.
In theory, I should have been eligible in 2017 as part of the first cohort when the program was first started in 2007. I should have been eligible for student debt cancellation in 2017. Instead, I was denied, and that would continue 8 times. So I was stuck in repayment for an additional 5 years. And all of the wealth building that I lost over that time period before the pandemic is has led directly to me being stuck in rentership. So when I think about how the educator crisis, right? The teacher shortage crisis, the public servant shortage crisis, and how our public servants are being forced to live farther and farther away from the communities that they serve.
They can't afford to
Because
live in the communities they serve. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. That has a direct impact on retention of our community heroes.
Right.
So I'm really glad that you're bringing this up, and that is where my primary focus is today,
Hmm.
as an advocate, as a survivor.
Yeah. And I think that so when you add these things together, because I mean, when you're on Twitter, obviously you're on Twitter, I'm on Twitter. When you're on Twitter, you see I don't even know what to call them. A lot of them seem like bots to me.
Mhm.
But they always have the same canned kind of
Right.
responses to very quality, legitimate arguments against, student loan,
Mhm.
aggressive collections against, people who've
Right.
defaulted, for instance. Um,
Mhm.
so I guess, those people say things like, well, you shouldn't have taken the loans out. And if you took the loans out, you got to pay them back. And it's just cut and dry. And they don't understand the sort of complexity of the issue, right? So they don't take the time to really educate themselves on the issue. And when you say there's a deadly trifecta of unaffordable housing, which is a huge, I mean, let's say we take student loan debt completely out of the equation and you just have unaffordable housing. It doesn't matter. That in and of itself is something that is, it can ruin people's entire livelihoods, right? Like in this
Right.
instance, I know as someone who's been in the service industry for many, many years, uh, you know, your wage is kind of capped. If you're
Sure.
a waitress, for example, you may make really good tips one week and the next week, not so much. So, there's a level of precariousness, I think, that goes along with being low income or middle income
Mhm.
and that type of thing. So, it's such a complex issue, and when you
Right.
take these things together, and as you call them, these sort of deadly trifectas of unaffordable housing, of
Right.
predatory student loan debt, and then real estate speculation, you have
Mhm.
gentrification of neighborhoods that were once very
Inclusionary
affordable.
zoning.
Yeah, and then I mean, it can affect all sorts of things,
Absolutely.
like
What you're really getting at is the damage that the financialization of what should be public goods has done to
yeah.
society.
Yeah. Yes. And on that note, I guess maybe I'll just jump to, do I want to jump to that? I'm just going to jump to it now because I think it would be good to mention it because this is something that, as someone with a master's in law, uh, this is something that I was really interested in the more I studied jurisprudence and stuff like that. So you say, in your article, Make Los Angeles Great Again, the Jewish Perspective, which was published in 2024 in the Jewish Journal, you say, when Jews talk of the great moral imperative to engage in acts of tikkun olam, I don't know if that's how you say it,
Yeah.
or repairing the world, they often forget the subsequent commandment of tikkun atzmi, or repairing the self, which arguably must come first. Why are these two commandments given one after the other? Perhaps it is because one does not repair the world without first looking inward to be the change one wishes to see in the world. And this reminded me of a paper I wrote last year on mishpat. This idea of justice, right? It's like I guess for people who don't know, in Judaism, mishpat translates to justice and encompasses kind of like fairness and equity and impartiality. But really, at its core, mishpat is not just a concept, right? It's like engaged justice. It's justice that is carried out into the world, and I think that that's something that we're missing, you know,
Or
in a big way.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and just to sort of to take that idea a step further, you know, the idea of that's so central to Judaism, but I would really put this at the core of Judeo-Christian tradition is the sense of personal responsibility
Mm.
in making this world a better place.
Yeah.
You know, we might not be able to change the outcomes, but we're not absolved of doing our due diligence to try.
Yeah.
And so that what that would mean in a sort of real life example is let's say you're a homeowner and you were fortunate enough to get into home ownership at a much earlier time when the barriers to entry weren't as high for middle income earners. You know, what that could look like is not pulling the ladder up from below
Mhm.
by opposing affordable housing developments in your community,
Mhm.
not joining a NIMBY, not in my backyard group of pre-existing wealthy, mainly white homeowners that attempt to block every new construction because the view will obstruct the sun that would wilt your zucchini garden,
Right.
right? It's sort of a sense of looking at the greater good rather than what's good for the self,
Yeah.
you know, and I would say another example would be if you were fortunate enough to have gone to college in the post-World War II boom economy, when college was free in California in the UC system, right? UC and Cal State system until the 70s, right? If you went to college at a time when tuition was either very affordable or even free at the state for a state-funded university, don't then look at the generations after you who
Mhm.
have become so burdened with student loan debt that they can't access
Yeah.
rites of passage and then
Right.
wag your finger and say, well, you borrowed it, you paid it back.
Right. Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
due diligence to
Yeah.
understand that problems evolve and change from generation to generation.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. There's so many people that benefited from cheap and or free college
Absolutely.
tuition who are admittedly of the older generations, and I have nothing against older people whatsoever. But it would behoove you if you are of this sort of group to sit down and educate yourself on
Absolutely.
what has been taking place in the world of student loans.
And if I could make one more example on that line,
Yeah.
over the pandemic, when the when 80% of PPP loans went to the top 20% of earners, including several notable members of our Congress, right? If you were the recipient of a PPP loan, don't then turn around and wag your finger at student loan borrowers,
Right. Yeah.
right? If
Yeah.
you're a millionaire who received a PPP loan, which was of questionable ethics to begin with,
Right.
don't then turn around and say student loan borrowers are going to take this debt to the grave come hell or high water.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. 100%. That irritates me so much on Twitter. I'm just like, oh my God,
Mhm.
why is it that we have all this money, right, to
Mhm.
bail out Wall Street, bail out the banks, bail out, everybody else who can file bankruptcy, by the way. But thanks to Joe Biden, we have this very unique situation where, we all as borrowers have been exempted from a constitutional protection, which is
Mhm.
insane.
Right.
Um,
Right. When we look at a problem, we have, in order to understand the true complexities of a problem, we have to look at who is benefiting from the status quo.
Absolutely.
So, and when we look at the entire sort of evolution of how bankruptcy protections were first removed from federal student loan debt and then from private student loans, and the roles of our politicians on both sides of the aisle who were complicit in removing these protections, right? The removal of bankruptcy protection from student loan debt really illustrates how corrupt money in politics have become.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep. Big time. Um, yeah, it's just it's mind blowing to me, and I feel, I mean, Alan Colenge and I kind of touched on this in one of my prior episodes where we talked about the media and lies and truth and
Yeah.
how difficult it is to sort of wade through some of the narratives around this issue. Because it's interesting, right? I mean, one of the things Trump talks a lot about is fake news. And I do agree with him. I do think that fake news is a real thing, right? I mean, I think we all know that that's propaganda. There's a lot of propaganda for a lot of things out there in the world. So we can't trust everything we read. And, I do think just based on my sort of own personal observation of Twitter responses, that the lending lobby must be actively pouring money into
Absolutely.
um, the creation of some of these narratives, and then,
Absolutely.
the
It's called
creation of,
seeding the media. They seed the
yeah.
media at great lengths. And I would say most of the voices of, who write on the issue of student loan debt. I mean, these are voices that are clearly corrupted.
Mhm,
Right?
yeah.
We actually know firsthand of, I'm not going to mention any names, but of somebody who was very involved in Democratic policy. And it turns out she was taking bribes from the DNC to further a narrative on student loan debt that made no mention of the imperative to return bankruptcy protections.
Yeah. Yeah. I know there's a couple people I could name, but I'm not going to name, and a couple
Mhm.
places that engage in think tank type stuff. But,
Right.
I mean, if anyone's interested in that, you can go back in my video timeline and look up the interview I did with Alan Colenge on Media Lies Truth. And I don't know, I think that
Mhm.
that's the title somewhere in there. So I was going to kind of circle back around to what you mentioned, something else you mentioned in the letter to the editor from December 17th, 2004 in the LA Times. You mentioned so all the complexities of daily life that many Americans face, particularly people who are engaged in child rearing and elder care, which is something that often goes unmentioned. It kind of sits under the radar in the student loan debt conversation.
Mhm.
Um, and people forget that student loan borrowers are not single entities unto themselves, right? Living in a bubble without families to care for. So, in
Correct.
my mind, this is an extremely important issue, is the illusion of numbers, right? So, while it's true that we have 43 to 45 million Americans who are student loan borrowers, many more millions of people are directly affected by the problem of insurmountable predatory student loan debt. If we add spouses, if we add children, if we add elderly parents or grandparents
Right.
into the equation, that 45 million number becomes staggeringly high.
Right.
It expands to over 100 million people.
Right.
Um, and this is something that I think the current administration probably doesn't have a grasp on. I think the lending lobby probably does, which is why they're fighting so aggressively on Twitter and things like that. they're trying to maintain this narrative, that if you are a borrower and you're not paying, you're irresponsible, which is really interesting. So yeah, I wanted to thank you for sort of highlighting the middle income people in your letter to the editor, because that is something, particularly around elder care, that's something that not a lot of people talk about. Um, so yeah, and I think you're right. I think making colleges tuition free again, and the state of California, I know was, right? You said in the 70s, and then Ronald Reagan is the one who changed it, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. When Reagan became governor of California, he did not want students protesting the Vietnam War
Yeah.
and thought that by instating a tuition-based model, that it would curtail their propensity to demonstrate against the government.
Yeah. And like, one of the things the bot commenters, I'll just call them that, one of the things
Mhm.
the bot commenters will always say is like, again, why did you take out the loans, or why did you get a
Mhm.
stupid humanities degree? Why didn't you go for something that was actually going to pay you a
I
salary?
know. Why didn't you go to trade school? Why aren't you a welder or a plumber? Right. I know. Right. Which
Yeah.
is, no disrespect to the trades at all, but we need all types of thinkers and workers for our society to flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and I feel like one of the things that also gets left out of the equation, you can tell me what you think on this as well, or if you have any observations on this, is the complicity of the academic institutions themselves in
Absolutely.
hiking tuition to, um, it's egregiously wrong how expensive some of these institutions have become. And for them, I feel like student loans, they know this, right? Student loans are like a blank check. So if you want to make money, you open as many programs up to the general public as possible. And then the student loan money starts flowing. I mean, there's a lot of really crappy institutions out there that are making use of this program to make a lot of money, you know.
Right. And not being transparent in terms of the real ROI on specific degrees, and sort of leading young, impressionable students into a specific degree without the sort of an honest conversation of what a career trajectory would look like in terms of return on investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess, I'm glad that we're talking. I also wanted to ask you some thoughts. I sent that thing to you via email about what I wrote or whatever. Um, so on the sort of topic of women, because that's of particular interest to me, is like women and children, particularly single mothers and their children, who are some of the worst affected in the sort of class hierarchy in our country, for obvious reasons, right? It's very hard to survive oneself on one income, much less raise a child. So, my sort of question for you is, do you think that there is a possibility that um, student loan debt kind of strangely coincides with the numbers of women entering university? Do you think that there's any kind of correlation between the rise in debt and the rise in attendance of women?
Yes, I do. You know, when we think about when college tuition really started to explode, right? We're talking about, really go from affordable to on its trajectory upward and then skyrocketing. We're thinking about like the late 60s, 70s, 80s, right? The time when women were really starting to exit the traditional role of homemaker.
Yeah.
And, and I would also put women and minorities, right? Because when we start to see minorities enter into college, much larger numbers as well, you know, that's when we really see tuition skyrocket. And more people are entering universities, many more people are entering women and minorities, and the need to expand services is very much there. So tuition rises. But then when we think about the origin of the student debt crisis, right, that really happens when bankruptcy protections are stripped away.
Right. Yeah.
Because what once bankruptcy protections were in essence removed, it was a slow burn away from federal student loan debt first, that's when tuition starts to skyrocket. And that's the 80s and 90s.
Mhm.
So absolutely, there's a correlation. And this was by design, right? Because with more women and minorities going to college, how much more exponentially more are we increasing the profit potential for the student debt industry? So these are millions of new customers, right? Who traditionally did not follow a college trajectory, but all of a sudden are starting to go to college
Right.
and they are being funneled as cash cows,
Mhm.
right? Into this massive debt scam.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it really speaks to, I mean, male governance and sort of, I guess if we look at who was really the sort of driving force behind the machine, it would be the lending industry. And at that time, in the 70s in particular, in the 80s, women were not at the helm of that boat.
Right.
That was very deliberately, it was very deliberately done, I think. And I think anyone who thinks that, I think anyone who thinks that feminism is not needed or that we don't live in a world that is patriarchal, I mean, you can have your opinion, you know, but
And also just it's very ironic because both of President Trump's secretaries of education have been women,
oh, I
right?
and there's a strategy there too, right? I
Right.
mean, appointing,
But
right?
when we think about and this really goes, it's ironic because the class divide is so pronounced.
Yeah,
Um, in both secretaries of education, both Caucasian women come from incredibly privileged backgrounds, and neither of whom have ever had either any direct or indirect exposure to the student debt crisis.
right, right. Yeah, and I mean, their children would never have to go through the process of filling out any of the FAFSA paperwork
Right.
or making promissory notes that they don't understand because their children can afford to literally go to university without using student loans. So I feel this is where I feel like we need a sea change in governance.
Absolutely.
We really do. We need a sea change in governance, in politics in
Yes.
general. This is a way larger conversation for another time, but
It is a larger conversation, but I want to just add one thing onto that, and
yeah.
that I want to add a fear that I have
Hmm.
going forward. As student loan debt pushes students away from college who'd ordinarily go, or pushes lower income students into the trades instead of into a college degree.
Hmm.
My fear is that the I would say access to the humanities will become a gate kept facet of society that is available only to the ultra rich, further stratifying what education looks like across class, gender, and race.
As it has been historically,
Correct.
access to the classics, for example, the classics is notoriously associated with wealth
Right.
because
Absolutely.
back in the 1800s, back in, if you go all the way back into the academy, the people who were attending and learning classics like Latin and Greek and
Mhm.
mythology and incorporating all of that knowledge into their fields, in whatever time period, were generally not coming from a place of poverty, right? They were
Right.
privileged enough to be able to have the time and
Correct.
the resources to do that, to sit there and learn dead languages all day. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that, and it's a pity because you know
Mhm.
those
Right.
things.
How many promising young minds are we going to lose
Yeah.
based on socioeconomic restriction to access without incurring massive debt?
That's it. And it goes back to what I wrote in my thing that I sent you. What was it? The history of student loans, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. The NDEA was enacted in response to the Soviet Union's launch of
Mhm.
Sputnik, aiming to
Right.
boost American science and tech innovation. It's
Mhm.
like student loans exist
Right.
because we were trying to, and because we were trying to expand
Mhm.
our strength really as a country, right? Our we're trying to expand our brains.
Right.
um,
And when President Johnson enacted the Higher Education Act of 1965, he declared that student loans would be free of interest, right? In order to allow access to the non-ultra wealthy Americans for the
mhm.
first time. And if we look at what happened in terms of interest from 1965 to present day, right? This is an aberration of the original intent of opening up access to college to more than the wealthy white American male.
Yeah, yeah. The standard by which all human rights are measured.
Right.
Truly. Yeah, that's another thing I realized when I was doing my master's. I was like, oh my God, human rights are measured by wealthy white men.
Mhm.
Not that I didn't like, I mean, I knew that on some level, I think subconsciously prior to studying it in depth, but it was kind of jarring when I sat back and I was like, oh my God, literally all international human rights documents basically speak to everyone and everything that is not a white wealthy man
Right. I would also add the word Christian in that too.
or
Right.
Christian.
Wealthy
Yeah.
Christian man.
Yeah. So that was really interesting. And it made me think of Catherine McKinnon. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
Hmm.
Yeah, she's a feminist
Hmm.
legal writer, lawyer, advocate. But, she wrote a book called Are Women Human, which is poignant. But, now here we are, right? And I think we can say there's a whole nother conversation, I think, actually to be had about human rights and debt.
Absolutely.
And there are human rights instruments. There are inclusions within the human rights, international human rights instruments that are lodged at the United Nations that countries have signed on to as members that do speak to the right to be free of burdensome debt.
That's a great point. And just, linking that back to women and sort of the disproportionate aggregate effect of debt on women, the close to $2 trillion student debt crisis, $1.7 trillion, two-thirds of that debt is held by women.
Yeah.
And if we dissect that even further, the group that holds the most student loan debt is African American women.
Mm, yeah.
They're as a cohort, the most highly educated
Yeah.
and hold the most debt.
I think personally it's time that we create new activisms around this issue. And I think that we need to recognize it as a feminist issue.
Absolutely, it is.
Um, and and it needs to change. Things need to change. Absolutely, 100%.
Right.
You know, because out of that cohort, right, out of the entirety of women debtors, right? Um, how many of them have children? How many of them don't have partners? How many of them are on welfare? How
How
many,
many are caretakers to
how many
family
are
members? Mhm.
caretakers? How many, what are they doing? I just, it boggles the mind. Um, and considering that we're still in 2025, not at a place where women are making the same amount
Nope.
as men, right? We're still sitting just below men in many ways. But financially, it's not right. It's not fair. It's not right. And it needs to change. And I think we need to start talking about it in a
Mhm.
way that is a little different. I'm not quite sure yet how to frame it, but I do feel that it is playing into women's oppression.
Absolutely. And also when we think about women's health care on top of that,
Mhm.
the disproportionate amount of, medical debt that women hold. Yeah. So I got a notification. I'll read you the title. Uh, the new Republican House Education and Workforce Committee plan called the Student Success and Taxpayer Savings Plan, which is connected to cutting a lot of government spending on education and putting it towards President Trump's tax cuts.
No.
So I encourage you to read about it. And I'm formulating my thoughts in terms of what type of op-ed I am going to land on.
Yeah.
Um, And I had a couple ideas. The first title is, Does America Want Educated People?
Right. Yeah.
The second is, if China and Russia were looking for ways to destroy America from within, they don't need to look any further.
True.
So, this is basically going to nosedive the number of students applying to college. So basically, this is a 30-year loan repayment term,
Mm.
basically another mortgage, right?
Hmm.
So, of course, but the difference being that there are no consumer protections with student loan debt, right?
Right.
So getting a student loan will be a 30-year debt sentence with zero consumer protections, zero truth in lending laws, of course, zero bankruptcy protections, zero statutes of limitations. Um, if we think we have teacher shortages now, just wait until people entirely stop going to medical school,
Yeah.
entirely stop going, to nursing school. And so
This is the one, right, where they're trying to put a cap on also. They're trying to cap how much somebody can,
amount borrowed. Yeah, I think it's 50,000 for undergrad, 100,000 for grad school.
which really limits the options, right? Like medical
Absolutely.
school and all of that is kind of out the window because, as we know, unless the US academic institutions
Lower
knock
tuition.
their tuition down to match that, they are going to be hurting as well. So I
Yeah.
would assume they would fight a little bit. I don't
And
know.
there is a clawback provision in this plan as well to, similar to what we saw in S 2598, but, to um, a provision that would force the colleges to reimburse the government a certain percentage of the loan that a borrower is not paying. But what I see coming down the pike here
Mhm.
is a precipitous drop in college attendance, especially in critical fields.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
basically, to all of those finger waggers at the borrowers saying, well, you took out this loan, you should have known the terms. I don't care if you were 17, you should have understood all of the fine print,
Right.
pay back every cent plus interest. To those people who don't think that they're affected by this, when all of a sudden they can't find a doctor,
Hmm.
or they'd have to travel much farther to receive basic care, it absolutely does affect them. To the
Yeah.
local business owners who all of a sudden cannot, nobody can afford to patronize their businesses any longer because their student loans have gone from 400 to 1,000 a month.
Right.
Student loan debt affects the entire community ecosystem, and that's something that I would say is missing in the zeitgeist around this crisis.
Yeah. 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 Ugh, yeah. And they passed it?
Not yet.
Oh,
Not yet. They just revealed it.
okay. 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 Well, that's good. Yeah. I feel like the institutions are gonna fight it because it's gonna hurt their pockets. And I don't know. I see them fighting it. However, I agree with you. I think that, if it goes through, we are going to witness a massive decline in highly specialized
Absolutely.
fields.
And also, just thinking about, look, if there was a guaranteed way to force people into a lifetime of permanent rentership and completely bar them from any chance of home ownership,
Right.
it's student loan debt.
Oh yeah, 100%. Oh yeah,
So
100%.
you're taking on a 30-year mortgage for your education without any protections, even before you take on a 30-year mortgage for a home.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's just simply not sustainable, given the reality of inflation and wage suppression in
Yeah.
this country,
Yeah.
especially when we look at women and minorities.
Right.
Well, but you know what? What a brilliant insight, because as somebody, with 3 jobs, 2 kids, and a dog, I can barely remember what I'm doing. I'm stretched so thin,
Yeah.
just as we as women are
Yeah.
stretched. This is what I want to focus on.
Yeah.
Let's segue into this.
Yeah.
As women, we are faced with so many expectations hoist upon us.
Mm-hmm.
We're now expected to be providers, but not at the cost of being full-time homemakers.
Right.
And, you know, so we need to earn a living, but also be fully present in the home, whether we are married or not,
Yep.
or whether we have partners or not,
Yep.
we and bear all of the responsibility of child raising. So when it's like, well, we go to work and come home and we have a double shift,
Yeah.
an unpaid double shift.
Yeah.
And, you know, um, that leads to so much stress. And what I've been experiencing and reading about is the connection between stress and memory loss.
Mm.
You know, in women, and it's like sometimes I find myself forgetting, people's names and like forgetting little things, and it
Yeah.
always happens when I'm experiencing like acute stress.
Yep. Yeah, and I know Alzheimer's and dementia affects women more than
Yep.
men. And I'm a firm believer that it's because of literally just by virtue of existing in the
Right.
world as a woman, because we are subjected to so many more social stresses and pressures and
Without the supports, right? We don't have paid family leave. It depends on the state, but there's no federal, family leave. There's no there's no support
Mhm.
for a mother, whether it's right from birth or supporting the child.
Right.
There's no support that would that helps ease the path and the burden of a modern American woman. And America is so primitive in this regard compared to other countries and even other third world countries.
I don't know. I have a special place in my heart for how this issue affects families, children especially because children, if I'm stressed out
Mhm.
or the mother, whoever she is stressed out, the children inevitably will be stressed out as well.
The
And
whole family and societal ecosystem is
mhm,
affected by student loan debt.
yeah, and
And how many marriages as well don't survive
oh,
debt slavery, right?
for
Because
sure.
student loan debt prevents any form of social mobility.
Yeah.
So you could have, assuming a married couple, you could have two people who are gainfully employed in strong places of employment,
Mhm.
say if one or both have student loan debt, forget about them ever becoming homeowners and how
Right.
much stress and resentment will build over time in that marriage.
Oh yeah.
Interesting to look at the correlation between student loan debt and divorce as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that would be fascinating. Also, there's so much crap. There's so much fluff and crap out there and these sort of fake narratives that are created
Right.
that serve only certain interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that whole narrative there for a while was this was like in the mid to late aughts of the 2000s. There was a big heavy focus on dating and not dating someone with a low credit score. That's
Hmm.
still prevalent today. I'm not actively dating, but I have like continued to see it, throughout media and whatnot. People make judgments. They make character judgments based on
Absolutely.
things like your credit score or your student loan debt, right? Like if you're,
Right. Why is it that you still have student loan debt at 40? What's wrong with you?
what's wrong?
What, where, what types of irresponsible financial decisions did you make that you still have this debt 20 years after graduating?
Yeah,
Instead of the narrative being, what is innately wrong with this system that despite years of paying it off consistently, that you're still not making any headway on the principal?
right.
That's the real question.
Yeah, yeah. That's it. But that's the inconvenient narrative. That is the narrative that does not, they do not want
Right.
to gain any traction because it works against the interest of the lenders and the
Right. The
politicians.
lending industry does not like women like us,
Yeah. No.
especially with a microphone and a platform.
Yeah.
Awful, just awful.
Yeah. But
I mean, these are the bottom feeders of society, who have become incredibly wealthy off of the immiseration of the middle and working class.
off of people who historically his generational poverty. I mean, the people who are qualifying for student loans are usually coming from families that haven't been
Right,
privileged enough to have trust funds, A, and
right,
B, go to school, you know. Um,
right. I mean, student loan debt creates two tiers of society, right? It by definition, right? It's if you come from generational wealth, you have free college.
yeah,
You go, your parents write a check, and that's it.
right.
If you don't come from generational wealth, that means you are stuck with predatory interest and fees in perpetuity, creating by default a servile class,
Yeah,
right? Um, a servile class that will forever be forced to remain in jobs catering to the ultra wealthy because they live paycheck to paycheck and they can't break out of the cycle of paycheck to paycheck, either to become homeowners or to ever rid themselves of this debt.
Yeah.
It's debt peonage. It's
That's
indentured servitude.
I just want to thank you so much for joining me.
My
Thank you for
pleasure.
sharing all of your insights and your opinions. And I'm looking forward to reading more of your work. And
Likewise.
do you want to direct people to, do you have a website or anything or anything?
I don't have my own website, but my parting words here for your audience would be to please join the fight. Nobody is immune to the consequences of predatory student loan debt. And even if you feel this is not your problem, if it's not now, it will be. If you care for a loved one with student loan debt, if you want to support businesses, but you can't because of predatory student loan debt, if you can't receive health care because you can't find doctors because there's an acute doctor shortage in your community because of student loan debt, if there are no teachers to service your schools because of student loan debt, we must all be responsible for creating a better way of financing higher education in this country, and every voice matters.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thank you, Lisa Ansell.
Thank you. Thank you for
Hopefully,
having me.
yes, anytime. Let's touch base again sometime soon.
Agreed. Thank
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye bye.